If you watch the Nixon seminar every month, you'll see a guy named John Noonan. And if you know anything about national security policy, you'll know that Mr. Noonan has been Tom Cotton's senior advisor for a long time. He is now senior advisor to Polaris National Security Strategies. John, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. Good to see you. Good to hear from you.
John, would you tell the audience you're our rare Air Force guest? I get Marines, I get Navy, I get Army people, but you're actually an Air Force guy.
I am. The Air Force, as you know, Hugh, saw fit to bury me in a missile silo during my 5 years in.
So whenever I pop up my head and say it's time to get rid of the land-based missile, I hear from John that I'm making a terrible mistake. John, I have spent all morning. You're my first guest in a 3-hour show today that I've had. And I spent all morning, I've been wall-to-wall callers, which I very rarely do, asking them what do they want asked on Wednesday night when Brett Baer and Martha McCollum start asking the 7 or 8, depending on whether former President Trump participates, candidates. What would you, John, if you were a debate moderator, what would you want to ask these candidates?
Sure, Hugh, it's a great question. And I assume you are baiting me into a military-focused question here. So
whatever you want. You can ask whatever you want.
I'm picking up what you're laying down. Look, I think for the purposes of a presidential debate, you have to start not even at the 30,000-foot level. You need to be at like the U-2 spy plane level. You got to be very broad, right? And so the questions are, probably unsurprising to you, is one, what do you intend to do about China? What do you intend to do about the U.S. defense budget? And then ultimately, what do you intend to do about Russia and Ukraine? And there is probably 3 million subtopics that fall under that. But those would be what I would call the big three, the triad, if you will.
They are the triad of questions. And, there's nothing wrong with the debate that would just be those 3 questions and those 7 people. I think that would be absolutely a great debate.
Yeah. And if you remember as a former debate moderator yourself, Professor Hewitt, I'm sure you remember that we generally do a national security foreign policy debate between both parties' nominees every year, and I think that's the right thing to do.
Well, there's not going to be. I do not believe there will be any fall debate in 2024. If President Biden is their nominee, there's just not going to be one, and they won't be able to agree on it. So I would like to learn now. How do you think it differentiates the field, John? What would you expect out of these 7 people? And I'll, for the benefit of the Steelers fans, it's Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, Chris Christie, former New Jersey governor, Senator Scott, Vivek Ramaswamy, Governor DeSantis, Mike Pence, and Nikki Haley. What would you expect to hear that would differentiate them?
Sure. You obviously have some broad-based agreement on the need for a bigger defense budget. With candidates like Governor Christie, Governor Pence, Nikki Haley, I assume Governor Burgum, but who knows? He's kind of an unknown to anyone outside the upper Midwest. But what I'm really looking for is seriousness and credibility as commander-in-chief, Hugh. Do they understand the threat? Do they understand that we are in truly, without hyperbole or exaggeration, probably the worst national security environment that we've been in since the heyday of the Cold War? With 1983 probably being a Cuban Missile Crisis like level of heightened threat. I think we're getting close. I mean, the Chinese are rattling the saber, they're thumping their chest, they're not making any. They're not trying to talk around the fact that they want Taiwan. We are in their way, and they intend to take it whether we are in their way or not. So the question
I've asked a lot of the candidates, would they fire on Chinese ships attempting an invasion of Taiwan, and all but one have deflected. Is that a good question, or is that too specific? You said go up to U-2 spy level. That's down at the water.
Yeah, that's almost under the sea. It is a great question, though. I think the reason that they're deflecting, Hugh, just having briefed presidential candidates and prepped them for debates in the past, is that you don't want to tie your own hands ahead of hypothetical scenarios. Right. You won't, let's say a President Pence or a President Haley or a President DeSantis, they aren't going to understand the full range and scope of their options until they sit down in the war room in the White House and they're looking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the eye, and the chairman is telling them we can do X, Y, or Z. And then they move over to their Secretary of State. Secretary of State says we can do X, Y, or Z. So I get it. I get why they're deferring. I don't think they're being too cute by half to do so. I think they're actually being pragmatic. But at the end of the day, I think we have, this is John Noonan's opinion. I think we have passed the point where strategic ambiguity, that is letting the Chinese try to guess what we're going to do, I think those days have passed, and I think we need strategic clarity. And that means essentially drawing a line in the sand saying our red line is you move on the Taiwanese, you're going to draw us in, and you better be ready for that eventuality.
Now, John, you are a veteran. You've worked for veterans, Senator Cotton. You've briefed other veterans who are running for office, and you've recruited people to run for office who are veterans. I am curious, how do you figure out if someone's going to be a good commander-in-chief via debate questions?
Yeah, it's very difficult, Hugh, because debates are so rehearsed, as you know. I mean, lines are practiced 20, 40, 60 times ahead of time. Debate prep often starts months in advance. So what I'm looking for is sobriety, for one. Two, credible policies. That is, policies that are focused on things like the efficacy of the U.S. military, how well they fight, the size and the scope of the U.S. military, that is the things they fight with, and the number of people that we have fighting, and then ultimately whether or not those things that we have are modern enough to fight in the 21st century. We have an incredible technologic base here in the United States. It's one of our great global strengths. Every day we're inventing something new and something wild and something that could redefine warfare. And I saw this for 12 years doing congressional oversight. I see a Pentagon that is utterly resistant to making those changes. They still want to buy all the old stuff. And a lot of the old stuff, frankly, is outdated. We don't want to be the guys who are, we don't want to be the French with the shorter bows and arrows, while the English longbowmen.
And we don't want battleships for World War II. I mean, they did have their role, but it was not the role that people anticipated. I'm curious. I've asked a few of the questions. Would you, a few of the candidates, what would your first big swing be on reconciliation? And I've been hoping someone would say defense reform, a Goldwater-Nichols Act of the new millennium. If you were to pass a Goldwater-Nichols Act, John Noonan, what would you put in it?
Sure. As for your listeners, Goldwater-Nichols was an act passed in the 1980s that essentially realigned our command structure. That is, where our generals are and who's in charge. And there was a little bit of playing who's on first. If you remember, Hugh, in the late Carter administration, we had the disaster at Desert One, which is where Jimmy Carter had intended to go in and rescue the hostages. It was a catastrophic failure, and one of the things that military planners looked at and realized in their after action report was the Marines weren't talking to the Air Force, and the Air Force wasn't talking to the Army, and Army wasn't talking to the Navy, and that needed to be improved. However, Goldwater-Nichols was almost 40 years ago now.
Yep.
It was passed during the Cold War. The threat environment has completely changed. There are some similar old actors that we're concerned about, no doubt, but we are in this unusual situation where we have a 4-star general or admiral who's in charge of U.S. Southern Command, which handles South America and Latin America, not a heavy threat exactly, but that person has the same seat at the table as the 4-star in charge of Indo-PACOM, which is where all the threats are, and so we have. What we tend to be very good at is we have something of a nonsense government structure, government-built structure that is not modernized for the threats. I'll finish with this, Hugh. If you remember, during World War II, we had a European theater of operations and we had a Pacific theater of operations. We had 8 million men in uniform, men and women in uniform, and that was perfectly adequate to prosecute a two-front war, the largest war the United States had ever been in. Right now,
they answered to one of three people: Nimitz, MacArthur, or Eisenhower. I guess Mark Clark, maybe one of 4 people, right, for 8 million people.
So you had your Army guy, you had your Navy guy, and you bring up Nimitz appropriately because the Navy was obviously a little more active in the Pacific than they were in the Atlantic. Atlantic, it was mostly convoy escort duty, whereas Pacific, they were fighting for islands, trying to seize control of the sea. We're looking at what will likely be a Pacific type war. Although I always like to use the Secretary Bob Gates line that when it comes to predicting conflicts, we have a perfect record. We've gotten it wrong every single time. So,
how do you get into someone's knowledge base on national security, John, without quizzing them and doing, who's the president of Nigeria? I don't want to do that kind of stuff, but how do you find out if they've thought about it and have been reading about it and actually thinking it through?
Sure. Well, look, I caveated that you want to keep this at the U-2 spy plane level for a debate, right? Because most Americans don't know the difference between a sergeant and a submarine, and that's
correct.
That's perfectly fine. I wouldn't expect a guy turning a wrench on an HVAC unit in Missouri to have to care about those things and worry about those things. All he needs to know is that whoever's in charge in the White House is sober, competent, serious, and decisive, and cares about maintaining America's supremacy in the world. However, I do think that there's a window for a debate moderator to pull a Hugh Hewitt and ask him a good question about the nuclear triad, just to test to see how well they've been studying the materials. Right? You don't want to go 2 miles deep on modernizing the submarine-based leg of the triad versus the land-based leg, or what they're going to do on modernizing the National Nuclear Security Administration, which builds our warheads. But I think it's perfectly okay, Hugh, to go ahead and test them and just say, are you up to speed? Have you read the books? Have you done the homework? That goes directly to the heart of your competency question.
I think sobriety is one of those interesting terms I haven't heard before, and I like it a lot. John Noonan with Polaris National Security. Thank you. Follow him on Twitter at NoonanJO.